Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Inderpal Grewal, a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies. She is also a professor in the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration program and the South Asian Studies Council, as well as an affiliate faculty member in the American Studies program. Professor Grewal is the author of Home and Harem, Nation, Gender, Empire, and the Cultures of Travel and Transnational America, Feminisms, Diasporas, Neoliberalisms. She has also published several edited and co-edited collections. Her ongoing projects include essays on the relation between transnational media and corruption and sexual violence. Today we'll talk with Professor Grewal about her forthcoming book, The Masculinities of Post-Colonial Governance, Bureaucratic Memoirs of the Indian Civil Service. Welcome, Professor Grewal.
Thank you.
Let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Well, the book is looking at a number of memoirs that have been published since India became independent in 1947. And this is about elite civil servants who wrote a number of memoirs about their lives and about their service. And I'm looking at these memoirs that were published since independence, but it started with the civil servants who came from the British period into into Indian government after independence. And then I'm looking since that period to people who were recruited or passed exams and became part of this elite civil service since then, and sort of up through 1990.
Okay, so there's kind of a mix of people.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about the terms, masculinities and bureaucratic memoirs. Tell us about those terms and what they mean.
Those terms are really important to understand from the viewpoint of feminist scholarship what's going on in independent India in the way in which people are governed. Right?
Okay.
And what's important about the masculinities part is for us to understand, how is bureaucracy a masculine occupation? What is it that tells us about the ways in which these people govern, how they relate to the people who they govern, how they relate to men and women among the people they are governing, how they pay attention to women, but also how they see themselves. What are their relationships with others in the bureaucracy? What are their relationships with their families? What are their relationships with those people who are their superiors and with politicians? So I'm looking at a set of relationships that constitute what people and how people think of themselves and what people think of bureaucracy to be.
Okay. And what gave you the idea? What was the catalyst of writing this book?
You know, the catalyst was I was looking at a case of sexual harassment of an elite civil servant in Punjab during the 1980s when there was an insurgency going on in that region. And I was looking at a very famous case. Her name was Rupan Deol Bajaj. And she accused a police officer of sexual harassment. And she was an elite civil servant herself, but she was in the civilian sector and he was in the police. So I was very curious about how is it that in this moment of insurgency that this case could become so notorious? How is it that she could win judgments in different courts against this police officer, even though the government was very much in favor of using this police officer to control the insurgency? So I was very curious, how is it that she was getting so much traction in this case? Because one of the things we know from feminist scholarship is there's a great deal of sexual harassment that goes on. There's a great deal of generalized violence against women that happens in most every society.
Right.
And it's only very recently that we've started to pay attention anywhere to employment and harassment within context of employment. So I was very curious about what was going on in that time. So as I started to follow this case, one of the interesting things that came out of this case was it wasn't so much a personal issue, it was an issue of one bureaucracy against another bureaucracy. That the civil service was very upset that the police service had so much power over governance in the region at that time. So it became a broader issue of the question of bureaucracy, contestations between bureaucracies, and the ways in which sexual difference, sexual violence, harassment could become a tool used in this kind of power struggle between bureaucracies.
Very interesting. Now, it surprises me to hear you say that there was a woman in public service. Was that commonplace for the time?
You know, ever since independence and the creation of the civil service, there have been contestations over including more women. Even at independence, as some of the nationalist leaders who had been very much part of the struggle for independence argued about how the country should be governed. And there were many who argued that India should just continue with the British civil service, just use and continue that civil service into the post-independence period. And they saw this as central to maintaining control and power and continuity and order in the country after independence. So, and that faction did win. And one of the issues that came up right at independence was that women nationalist leaders were arguing that we should have more women in the bureaucracy from the get-go too, from the start. So this was an issue that started at the very moment of independence when people were negotiating what the civil service should be, who should be in it, what kinds of people should be in it, what are the characteristics we need in it. So this was an issue. At the beginning, though, when they were thinking about how to include women in the civil service, the path in the civil service was often quite different for women than for men. So generally, and this was part of what the British civil service had started, people who passed the exams to be part of the civil service were, at the first instance in the apprenticeship years, sent to rural areas. So they had postings in rural areas where they worked with other people, where they came to know the region, came to know the people, the local people, and this was supposed to get them into becoming much more familiar with governing at a smaller rural scale.
Right, so it was kind of like a training ground.
But after independence, it was often argued that if women became part of the civil service, they would not be safe if they just went to rural areas on their own. So they had different kinds of jobs allocated to them. But this also meant that they couldn't follow the normative path to rising to the top of the bureaucracy just because they didn't have that rural experience. And so this has changed over time, of course. But at the beginning, this was an issue. Another issue was, should they remain in the civil service after they got married? Should they have to leave the civil service once they got married? So this was another issue that was raised at the beginning, but was, of course, resolved later on that, you know, women can stay as long as they're up to their retirement age. So there were some ways in which women's path in the civil service, their role was somewhat different at the beginning.
Okay, so how did you, let's first, I'd like to know what's the difference between a bureaucratic memoir and, for instance, an autobiography?
That's a really good question. So autobiographies, if you look at the key autobiographies that came out in India, it was sort of Nehru, the leaders of the nation, writing about their lives and how they became leaders, right? And there have been other autobiographies as well, but these were very powerful people, very influential people reflecting upon their lives. There's also been autobiographies of authors, writers who wrote about themselves. And these were often deeply personal, right? Gandhi's autobiographies are all about his struggles with his self and how to become a leader, how to deal with questions of personal spiritual struggles, how to forge a new India, all of those questions. Right. But they came from very personal struggles in some ways. These memoirs are not so much personal. Okay. And what they are is they deliberately leave out the personal aspects. So they will not talk about marriage. They will not talk about love. They will not talk about family. They will not talk about about the household. And so these memoirs are more designed to be lessons in governance, how to govern. This is what I did as a governor. This is what I became as a bureaucrat. This is the formation of the bureaucrat rather than the formation of the person. Right. So in the autobiography, the leader, the person becomes intertwined in some way. In these memoirs, it's all about how I became this elite civil servant. What were the formative professional routes that I took?
So basically job and career, and that was it, which is very interesting. I mean, how did you find these? Or it seems like a very, it's unique, I think. Is it a unique thing to?
No, actually, especially in the first generation of civil servants, these are very literate people. Many of them were very educated. Many of them have been educated at Oxford and Cambridge. They were used to writing. They were saw themselves as the leaders of the nation, setting the path to nationhood. And they thought very well of themselves. They were powerful. Sure. Being in the British civil service had made them extremely powerful, extremely influential. So because of that power and influence, I think that they thought very well of themselves and their ability and their opinions. Okay. And so they were very ready to share those opinions with subsequent generations. Right. The other reason was, I think what happens after independence is that many people come to view this particular group of civil servants, which is the Indian Administrative Service. It's called the IAS. And it was a kind of civil service that saw itself as sort of having some continuity with the British civil service. So many of the British civil servants became part of the Indian Administrative Service. And it's an elite service, right? So there were elite people in it. So part of the reason was they were elites. They saw themselves as very important.
And the majority of those people were men, not women.
Majority of men. And what's remarkable is how many of them in that first generation after independence wrote about these memoirs. Many of them had important papers that subsequently other generations put together in forms of a memoir too. So what I'm interested in is how do people remember these civil servants, and why do they remember some of them more than others, right?
Okay, so how did you find these memoirs, and how did you choose which ones to use for your book, and just basically what your methodology was?
So when I started to look into these, there were so many, and I have found that every lecture that I give on this topic, I will find someone or the other coming up to me and saying, have you read thus and such memoir? So there are a tremendous number. Some are published by very prominent publishers in India. Rupa and Company is one of those that has published many of them. And some are self-published. Some are very small presses that are have been hard for me to find. So I'm always on the search for these memoirs as well.
Any written by women?
That's a really good question. It's harder to find those. So as I do this work on the book, what I'm trying to see is what are the forms of writing that the women bureaucrats offered, right? And what I find is that their subsequent generation, their children, grandchildren, have not taken that much time to put together their papers and made them published and available to others. So it's been harder for me to find some of those. So what I do is combine a little bit of interviewing oral histories, trying to look at newspapers, seeing if there are cases of, sexual harassment was one example I gave you. And when I found that story, then I went and spoke to the civil servant who was the center of the case, and she gave me a bunch of her papers. So it's been a little bit of detective work, sleuthing, chasing after leads and people telling me about them.
Okay. So how many ultimately did you include in the book?
Well, I'm in the process of writing the book, so I haven't finished it.
Okay.
I'm still looking for them. I have a whole bunch of the high caste men's memoirs. Those are the published forms. I'm still not completely done with the research on finding the civil servants who came from the Dalits, who were part of Dalit, which is the formerly lower caste, the untouchables. But that group, I'm still looking for their work. And I found some, and they're so interesting because some of those are more concerned with talking about the discrimination that they faced in their professional lives. So they become much more deeply personal than the other ones that I'm looking at. So they deal with the discrimination, how they are in a profession where there are many elite, high caste people, and they enter this profession from a very different community and come to have very different experiences. So that kind of clear division between public life and private life that I saw in the memoirs of the high caste bureaucrats is maybe going to be quite different when I write about the Dalit.
Right. Well, that actually leads me to a fascinating, I think, question in terms of there was no discrimination of who can actually be a civil servant. So they were openly able to become one, but then they were discriminated once they became one.
Right.
Isn't that interesting?
Well, it is interesting, but
they weren't barred from becoming one from the get-go.
No, they aren't. And actually, they have affirmative action programs now for different groups. Right. But at the same time, when you think about how people become bureaucrats, it's by these very intensive exams that you have to take. And so the question is, who is prepared to take the exam becomes the issue that we face here in the US with the SATs and the other exams. So you will find more privileged people who get tutoring, are more prepared, have an advantage to be able to take these exams, and people who have, struggled to find the books, are from low-income communities who don't have the education that allows them to excel as much. So they're disadvantaged anyway. So even though it seems like a meritocracy, it's actually not a meritocracy.
Okay. So are you planning on including any of the women's memoirs in your book?
I've found really interesting accounts in oral histories, and I am going to include them. I have a chapter on them, but it's going to be an interesting chapter because it's, again, going to be much more personal than the ones that I have thus far written about, the high caste men who write about them. So once again, it's more about struggles, it's about personal lives. And I'll tell you one interesting story. I was chasing down one woman bureaucrat, and I found that she had passed away, and I went to meet her husband to ask him about whether he had any papers, whether there was anything that I could use from her life in order to write in my chapter. And he handed me a book of poetry. He said, read this. This is where she really expresses herself. Wow. And that was so striking to me, that instead of a book that was about, here's how to govern, here's what subsequent generations might do, she has this deeply personal way to think. But of course, that's only a small part of the story. I am sure that with, different generations of women how they express themselves and how they see themselves as a bureaucrat has also changed.
Right.
So that will be interesting for me to look at.
Right, okay. So ultimately, why is it important to look at these kinds of memoirs in terms of the larger picture of life during that time?
Yeah, I think it's really important because one, these people are very much in charge of the lives and the welfare of so many people, right? And to understand their motivations, to understand what their networks are, to understand who they favor, who they can have empathy with, who they can think about, how they view different groups of people, and the kind of ways in which the diversity of India itself demands certain kinds of knowledge and empathy of people means that you have to understand bureaucrats really well.
Right.
So far, historians have looked at many of these memoirs as just an archive, that here's what I can look at into finding out, into writing a historical narrative of a period, of another person. Nobody has really looked at these memoirs as a kind of literary genre of a bureaucracy. How does a bureaucracy write itself? So this is what I'm interested in. How does a bureaucracy write itself? How does a bureaucracy write itself as a gendered human being, as belonging to a particular group, as seeing themselves as part of a important part of the nation itself? So, and what we've seen in India today is, since this civil service is so dogged with charges of corruption, people, even from independence, common people think of them as too elite, as too corrupt, as uncaring of ordinary people's lives, as only kowtowing to the politicians. So there's a great deal of suspicion among ordinary people in India of this very elite group. And I'm also interested in thinking about, well, how does that suspicion translate into the way they behave?
Right.
Is that suspicion justified? What is the fear of corruption? How does it affect these people? Does it change their behavior? Does it make them more open to all kinds of people? What does it do in the matter of governance?
Right, right. Well, we will look forward to learning more about that when your book comes out. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay. For more information about Professor Grewal and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.